Welcome to the final session of the 2023 Symposium for the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University. Happy to see you all here. There are more of you here than I would have guessed. That is a good thing. I am doing my very last version of introducing myself. If you all want to do it for me, I would understand. I'm Chris O'Brien. I'm the director of the Theodore Roosevelt Center, and everybody in this room has heard that now about 100 times. But the people who are going to catch this streaming later and live on our YouTube channel, where you will all be stars, have yet to hear it. So it will pop up later. The good folks at Consolidated, let me give them a shout out. They have provided all of the video streaming. They'll do just set up our YouTube channel. Thank you. That's Trace right there. Ron was with us last night. We have a number of other folks to thank. The president of the university, Dr. Steve Easton, sitting right over there. The staff of the Theodore Roosevelt Center, Kelly Highlands, Eric Johnson, William Hansard, Mary Massad, who you have watched pull all this together right here at the end. Thank you, Mary. There you go. Clay Jenkinson, who once again has done a brilliant job. Thanks, Clay. And to our many sponsors, the Robin Melly Walton Foundation in particular, but others as well, to the Rough Rider Hotel, the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation for hosting us. Thank you all. And now I get to sit down for the rest of the day. Thanks.
Just a couple of things. Good morning, everyone. We're glad you're here. Some of you have not been with us in Dickinson, but we're so glad to have you here. We'll be talking for the next hour, sort of in an informal way. This is my favorite part of each of these symposia because we get to have a really casual conversation, and this is your chance to ask any questions that you please of any one or all of our presenters. Just two quick announcements. So our field trip into the Badlands may change a little bit. We are still going at 1 o'clock. But there are some road closures, so we may go on Jones Creek Trail rather than the entrance station trail. So stay tuned, but it'll all be fine. Tomorrow, for those of you who are interested, the Badlands Conservation Alliance, Shannon, raise your hand. He's our executive director. We're leading a hike to the Elkhorn, unrelated to this, except that it's about Roosevelt. And that's tomorrow morning at 9 in Chimney Park for those who are going to join us. And we'd love to have you join us. There's no cost. It's maybe your chance to get to the Elkhorn Ranch with the Badlands Conservation Alliance. So, Michael Connolly, Benjamin Wetzel, TJ Stiles, Robert Bland, Denise Lajimodiere, the poet laureate, of the state of North Dakota. We're here, but Michael Connolly, would you just come up in 2 minutes, set the table for this discussion?
Okay.
I love the pretense of reluctance.
I love getting put on the spot. So, so the theme of this event has been freedom struggles, and if I can maybe just ask a question of everyone and try and pull together all of the talks and discussions that we've had so far. But it seems that there's some issues that we've discussed that resonate across all of the presentations. So one of them is the conflict and tension between individuals and groups and society, whether that's in the Reconstruction generation, how that operates, whether it was in TJ's talk in terms of citizenship and how citizenship operates on those two levels. And the other question I had was about violence and what role violence plays. And Rob and I were just talking about this. Violence on the frontier, violence in arresting people and charging them with offenses, violence in Native American, our history with Native Americans. How does that feature in all of your talks, and how does that feature in freedom struggles? Both the tension between the individual and the group, and the role that violence plays on the frontier in America.
Thank you, Mike. So, who wants to pick it up? Who wants first?
Go me. You want to just go down? Okay.
We don't have to go. We don't have to go road, but you start.
How do it? Test. There we go. I think to start off, the conflict between peoples in New York in 1895 and 97 to 97, especially when it comes to Roosevelt. The real problem, I think, makes sense through a quotation from Jacob Riis, which says, in order to help the poor, we have to fight the poor to do it. And so in a lot of ways, Roosevelt's time in the police commission was about enforcing what he saw and what Protestant private organizations saw as morality, or what was moral. And in order to do this, on the violence part, Roosevelt, as police commissioner, he made the force significantly more deadly. He increased the size of batons to make them stronger and easier to hit people with. He helped get the same guns for everyone on the force and mandated a certain type of pistol as well as training for those pistols. So you had him trying to create a more enforcing force in New York City. So just to start off, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Mike. So I guess how I think about that with what I shared was with the group and individual tension, I found that to be a really fruitful theme throughout all this. Not that I never thought about it before, but TJ's talk was especially helpful in thinking through that in more depth. And I think of Roosevelt's support for someone like Oscar Strauss as the first Jew to be appointed to a cabinet position. That didn't necessarily mean that Roosevelt didn't, again, say some anti-Semitic things in his private correspondence. So there's that tension between this particular person is worthy and I want to honor him versus a kind of egalitarianism that we would hope that maybe he would have espoused. Same thing might be true for Reed Smoot in the Mormon case in LDS Church. As far as the violence part of the question, I think Roosevelt's support for World War I and the religious language that he used for that, and I won't say there was never a war he didn't like, but I mean, rarely a war that he didn't find something to like about. And his famous quotation and point of view was righteousness had to come before peace in World War I. And so I think that really sounds good in theory. It might be something that we would agree to, but how he applied that sometimes is maybe open for question. But certainly using that religious language to support the war was an instance, one of many in which he used that to support some kind of violence.
I've talked a lot about, is my mic not on?
There you go.
Everybody likes it better that way. Sorry about that. I've talked a lot about the individual versus groups and that tension. So I just want to say something because I popped into this conversation before this session about violence in America and in the West specifically. And, there's been a lot of good work about violence in American history. One of my mentors when I was getting started was Richard Maxwell Brown, who he had his own particular theory, and actually I don't always agree with it, but it's a useful way of starting to think about it, which is he posited that, especially in the West, there was a Western Civil War of incorporation, picking up on Alan Schachtenberg's book about the age of incorporation. When, and this is something that also was a theme in my book on Custer, America is becoming more institutionalized, the society and economy was becoming more integrated, and in the West, as this broad area, often lightly populated, there's a tension between people who've gone there specifically because it's not incorporated, and people who were investing capital and trying to make it a part of the mainstream society in market economy of the U.S. And you see this in the case of Stuart Stranglers, which represented the large ranchers, people, men of means, whose one of their main concerns actually in the Montana Territory was the tension with mining interests and who controls the legislature. But they also face the challenge of, these groups of wolf hunters, cattle rustlers, horse rustlers. They especially hit out in the Missouri breaks, and there was actually a almost continental scale of black market for stolen cattle and stolen horses. And so they engage very much in a organized campaign in which as many as maybe 50 or more people were killed as they tried to stamp this out. And it wasn't just law versus disorder, but it was an attempt, again, to organize and stabilize the West. And, this picks up on a theme that's very deep in American history of kind of locally organized violence by the interests that are kind of dominant in that area. We see this very much in the South, where pre-war slavery patrols by slave owners and young men in the South are out enforcing, not only capturing people who are trying to free themselves, but also enforcing passes, et cetera, et cetera. And that very much transitions into the Ku Klux Klan and other groups. And there's this tension during this period between that kind of locally organized violence and centralized law enforcement, whether it's in formal, county sheriffs, state police, and federal enforcement, which we see during the Grant administration and not much afterwards. So, this is a major theme, who controls law and order, and what does law and order mean? Now, in the Badlands, as somebody who had invested, much of his inheritance in the cattle industry, and also someone who personally, we have to remember the personal side of Roosevelt, somebody who never wanted to be pushed around here, and somebody who really kind of romanticized that personal violence, kind of wrote very enthusiastically about the time he knocked out the guy who was terrorizing the bar out west. He's somebody who believes in standing up for himself, that everybody should do this. And so he really wants to join Stuart Stranglers. And it's lucky for him, actually, that he was pushed out of it. But, he had a romanticization of this. But when we look at it, we have to remember these are part of larger patterns in American history. And we have to think about who are the people on each side. And it's not that it's good versus evil, but this is a part of a sorting out of an area that's being incorporated into larger American society.
I really appreciate that question, Michael, and just this I'm thinking through the kind of centrality of violence in the life of both Robert Smalls and Theodore Roosevelt, and the kind of way that they were of a generation where both understood violence as a generative experience. Robert Smalls, through his Union military experience, W.B. Du Bois writes about how only murder makes men, right? And, there's a specific way that the kind of Civil War was not only kind of a battle for liberation and the destruction of slavery, but kind of, as many scholars note, when we get to the end of the 19th century, there's this great fear that kind of the generation that fought the war is beginning to kind of fade away, beginning to die, and that the kind of men who are coming of age in the late 19th century haven't experienced the war, right? Kind of part of the fervor for entering kind of the Spanish-American War in 1898. We kind of see this in Roosevelt's kind of writing in his life, right? This is a moment to test manhood. This is a moment, a regenerative moment, right? It kind of ties into this broader kind of question in American history about kind of Frederick Jackson Turner and the kind of idea of a frontier. And I think when we think about Reconstruction, we should think about the South as a frontier space at this moment, right? It's having to be reincorporated, right? It's kind of under occupation, right? The states have to reapply to re-enter the Union. The kind of idea and the tension of kind of places where there's safety and freedom, precisely because you have the bayonet of the Union, you have the bayonet of the federal military. But outside that space, right, this is a place where the KKK is beginning to kind of enact kind of a reign of terror. And kind of the place that I study, the South Carolina Low Country, right, is both a place that is made by federal power, but also made by a density of African American Union soldiers, right? And that threat of violence keeps the Ku Klux Klan at bay, which also kind of creates this kind of identity, right? I talked about racial gerrymandering in my talk yesterday, right? That kind of, at the same time that you have a 14th Amendment, you have a moment where people are beginning to understand individual citizenship, individual rights, right? The moving away from a group identity. An act like racial gerrymandering returns this idea of racial identity being important for political purposes, right? Both being kind of having to navigate racial identity as a way to kind of collect votes, to kind of move through a polity, but also, right, kind of as an idea of solidarity and the idea that if this is going to be a place where both African American political rights still exist, but also communities are safe, and right, you can kind of avoid the threat of violence, then you can understand how identity will matter more. And as I think through this moment, right, and the many scholars who are kind of thinking about that kind of military moment as a generative space also understand, right, the kind of what is the danger of kind of constantly having to return to this well of regenerative violence, right? And in particular, right, the kind of tension that you increasingly see in African American history, Native American history, right, is kind of some of these veterans go on to the West and become Buffalo Soldiers, move to Oklahoma. What is the relationship between African American communities and settling the West, and kind of Native American communities are increasingly being pushed out of those lands in the West, right? So kind of on the one hand, I think Smalls would have had a blind spot in seeing kind of the regenerative violence of the frontier. He was a Union man. He was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic. He was a veteran of the Union, right? Kind of understanding that the Union's role kind of moving westward as a positive kind of story of American expansion, and the way Roosevelt would have understand kind of American empire having a duty to move into these spaces that were not civilized, were not developed. Have this tension between incorporation and kind of frontier individualism, which kind of is one of these central tensions in American history. Denise.
Boy, sometimes imposter syndrome sort of sets in. I was sitting here with Pulitzer Prize winners and these academics that have written books and incredible academic articles about Teddy Roosevelt, or TR, as I hear that he's called. As a Native person living on a reservation in north central North Dakota, I have not paid much attention to Teddy Roosevelt, so I've learned a lot about him since I've been here. And I was in Medora, I think, about 30, 40 years ago. For this beautiful drive-in, seeing the Badlands. So but I think Chris, he kind of convinced me that I had a place here. I liked the theme of this symposium. So right now, we just received a treaty settlement from our treaty that I say that our chiefs had to sign sort of symbolically with guns at their heads back in 1892. It was, I called it an agreement. And so our territory originally was like 1/4 of North Dakota all the way south, like say Devil's Lake now, and then south to nearly to Fargo was our territory. And we slowly through these agreements lost so much of our land. So it's just almost heartbreaking to get that little check, in the mail, because it represents such loss. And then, so we say there was attempted genocide of Native people. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. And then there was a cultural genocide in boarding schools where Pratt said, kill the Indian in him and save the man. So we've lost a lot. But we are currently in reteaching our language at the community college and building up the infrastructure in the reservations and just trying to do the best we can with all of the history and the violence that has happened to us. And I think I write about that in my poetry. Some of you heard some of the poems last night. So I just want to thank Chris and the invitation to be here as a poet, not as a scholar about TR, but thank you.
Most welcome. So questions for any or all of our panelists. This is your time. We want to make sure this is your chance to bring our attention to certain subjects. Who wants to start? Please don't hold back.
Yes, sir. I think I did this last time you were here. I first wanted to welcome everyone to Medora, but a rejoinder, if I may, to Mr. Stiles, and it was Herman Hagedorn that we believe sourced the words of Randall Seward's widow and second wife, that G.R. wanted to be a member of Seward's Stragglers. And I'm just glad to source the academic paper done by Austin Parks, a young man from Minot who portrays Clinton and Kermit Roosevelt, just included a year as clerk to the North Dakota State Supreme Court. Kid's got great academic shop. And he, with Doug Allison, Rolf Schletten, and other source materials, proved that if you go through the very detailed itinerary that each man, Marquis Moore and Theodore Roosevelt, kept in the 1883 and 87 years, there was no time that the two men have gone to Miles City and had tried to join the Stuart Stranglers. which is what Hagedorn's source said. And then every subsequent significant biography of Theodore Roosevelt for 50 years included that sort of. But we're Austin Marks always won the history prize. MND.
Actually, that's a good point. I'd completely forgotten about it. My point rather is not so much about his personally joining, but he definitely sympathized and he wrote about Stuart stranglers in a very sympathetic way. And so I totally accept the correction about him wanting to be a part of it, but he enthusiastically endorsed it. And there was a close connection between the ranchers associations and the Dakota Territory and in Montana as well. Like I said, in Montana, that was also a part of a struggle for power in the state legislature between mining interests. So, you know, they had their own agenda, but certainly they both saw it that way. And, you know, one thing I want to mention, too, is just the role of the federal government. You know, we think of the West as this, especially at that time, as this vast open territory. And yet the federal imprint in the West has always been really huge. So you have these cases of like Stuart stranglers and other groups, or cases like the Cochise County War, where you've got local interests that engage in outright warfare, or the Lincoln County War in Southwest. And yet, you know, the federal imprint on the West is huge, whether it's the movement of black families following black soldiers, and just as Robert mentioned, as the Buffalo Soldiers were deployed west so they wouldn't be in the South, you know, trade routes and migration routes are protected by soldiers, or as Benjamin Madley's written, you know, the great genocide, very deliberate, naked genocide of Native Americans in California. There was a large federal role that had been missed for a long time. So TR, you know, he had this romanticized idea, but he was very much believed in, if necessary, violence for incorporation. And as has been mentioned before, he famously connected it to labor violence. You know, he hated the anarchic in society and the anarchic violence, and he believed in suppressing it. And when he talked about, you know, responding to Haymarket with bringing his ranch hands, you know, that's a direct connection. I don't think a conscious one, that violence to maintain a civilized, ordered society is not necessarily a bad thing, can be a good thing.
Yes, who has a question? Go ahead.
So the statement was made that studying abroad patterns of history is not really a struggle between good and evil, and yet history itself has largely reduced the study of history to the relationships between individuals. And for me, and I believe many people, one of the reasons TR is for studying is because in his own life, every single decision he made seemed to be a struggle between good and evil. And so my question is, how do you resolve the struggle of individuals between good and evil, which for me is what history is, with his statement that studying the broad paradigms of history is not the struggle between good and evil?
Look, I don't want to be the only one talking. I certainly believe that there's evil and there's good. And I think, for example, the story of Reconstruction is, you know, you have people who were not necessarily good. Like I said, in 1860, 4 northern states banned the immigration of black people. And those same people who passed those laws are involved in Reconstruction. So, you know, not everybody on one side of an issue or the other side is good on this side, evil on that side. And yet we can see, you know, the clear injustices and wrongs and evils that take place, and often there are individuals who are frankly evil. So that's true. What I was talking about in that specific case is thinking about, you know, thinking about every issue and reducing it to good guys and bad guys. And it's almost always more complex than that. That there can be clear issues and that are, you know, which great evil is done, or people are really fighting for goodness, as we may agree today. And yet we can't, if we stop, history has to be about finding the good guys and finding the bad guys, then we miss all the complexity, we miss all the, we miss the structure of what's going on. I mean, history isn't just about individuals, it's about everything. and larger structures, individuals, huge changes, small ones. I mean, study of history is the study of everything. So you don't have to check your moral sense at the door, but what you have to do is try to understand the times. I mean, somebody else, please chip in.
I think it comes back to our anthropology, ultimately, what we think about who human beings are. And I think if we look at ourselves honestly and we look at historical figures honestly, we see a mix of good and evil in everybody. And we hope, in this case, as we judge the sources, that we can see from our perspective the good outweighing the evil here, the evil outweighing the good here. But nobody's a sinless saint. Nobody's a one-dimensional cardboard villain. And so it's hard to talk about the triumph of this unambiguously good person over this unambiguously evil person. That when we look at ourselves, we don't want to be judged by the worst thing we ever did. And so we extend grace to those in the past, recognizing that we're all complex human beings with a mix of both. And then I think that allows for that complexity that TJ and the others have kind of talked about. That, again, we don't check our moral sense at the door, but we're aware that there's a deeper story there. And honestly, it gives us humility too, because for every source we have, there's 40 that we'd like to have and don't have. And so we're aware of the limits of the historical enterprise, not that we can't say anything, but that we don't have the full picture. And so our judgments always have to be measured with, I'm pretty sure, or I think, or my best judgment leads me to this.
Just to continue, I completely agree with Ben. Like, it's not a binary. There's not good and evil. There's a lot more complicated questions. Like when we're looking at TR's work in New York as police commissioner, we have TR's perspective, and which is fine, but we don't have the perspective of the people that he was policing in a lot of these cases. We don't have, well, also at the same time, his group was calling sex workers and other people evil. It was the social evil. It was morally repugnant to a lot of these people. But at the same time, these people were still humans. They were doing what they thought was right for them. They were doing what they needed to do to survive. So you need to take in their perspective and their lives into looking at what history is and what history means for other people as opposed to just someone that we might agree with or has a similar point of view.
So my mentor, Ev Alger, said, judgment is easy, understanding is hard. And historians are about understanding and nuance and complexity. And I think you can't really understand anything unless you grant at least limited agency to every player, every stakeholder, however difficult and sometimes morally repugnant that is. But almost every group and every individual is sort of the hero of their own narrative, and their righteousness is extraordinarily deep. So it seems to me that it's not in our interest to do a lot of judgment. It's our preliminary work should be investigation and understanding, right, Robert?
And I think the best history, the best narrative history, right, often takes sides, often makes strong arguments, but also offers kind of complex figures, right? So the heroes of the story, right, are not kind of on pedestals, and the kind of villains have kind of a justification, right, for their action. But it also highlights a kind of broader kind of struggle where, I mean, history is constantly reinventing itself as kind of consensus changes, as kind of scholars return to moments we all know well, but with different sources or with different modes of analysis. And in that way, right, the kind of returning to this big synthesis, kind of, so what does it mean when kind of we have academics, right, on a panel speaking, and kind of then you talk about what's in the K-12 textbook, or what kind of community commemorations are happening, right? In what ways do parents talk to children? Do you have kind of memory working, right? History and memory often being in tension with each other. And often, right, historians have to think seriously about the way we speak to historians, often in academies that can kind of be alienating, but also being kind of honest about kind of when you try to write big narratives, when you try to say, and this says something about the American experience, and this ties to a way we can kind of speak to each other's collective, right? The kind of desire for grand narratives is something that is alluring, but it also has its own dangers, right? Has its own kind of necessary structures that leave things on the cutting table, have to make things a little simpler, have to paint in a broader brush, right, to kind of tell a bigger story. But those are the stories that people can often grasp. Those are the stories that help us make sense of our day-to-day lives. We sometimes look to history for a usable past, and I think that is one of the uses and the kind of importance of history.
Thank you, Robert. There's a question here.
Speak up, please. Yeah, I could not.
Here was Theodore Roosevelt from a aristocratic, wealthy family, New York City, Albany, why do you think, with a guy with so much exposure in the world, would make the statement, if it hadn't been for my experience in North Dakota, I would never have been president? What do you think he meant by that?
What was behind?
Okay, I guess I'm on the spot as the TR biographer. But that's really interesting because he was very much a part of patrician society in New York. And not just wealthy society, but the society of old merchants. And there was a division between the kind of new elite of industrialists and financiers, and there was a social tension with the older seagoing merchants, and his family were importers. So they were not only an old Dutch family, but they were of the right type of industry to be at the very elite socially. And his father was a prominent philanthropist, and yet he himself had struggles that made him want to go through life constantly wanting to prove himself. And again, I think a real touchstone is not only did he have asthma, but he, on his famous trip to Maine, he's in the stagecoach and he's being bullied and he can't do anything about it and the other boys are laughing at him. And I think that really scarred him. He really wrote about it in a way that he was determined never to have that happen again. So he was constantly wanting to prove himself better than his social peers. And he's constantly speaking to them. He's constantly giving talks about how you can't be too high and mighty to get involved in politics. You've got to take part with the bricklayer as an equal, and you've got to be making laws for society and helping to run things. And when it comes to American society in general, he wanted to go out and prove himself. And I think you see some of the best of him in his writings about the West, when he admits that he was nowhere near as good a horseman or roper, and he's learning from the men that he's with, and that he admires a lot of these people like his main guides who he brings out west. He admires them, but it's also a chance for him to show that he's bringing Sewell out there, and he's showing that he actually knows more about this frontier than the main frontier where they're the kings, and he's kind of proud of that. But he's in the mix, and he's kind of proving himself, and he feels like he does prove himself in the end, and that's why it's so core, I think, to his identity.
Yeah, just to build off what TJ was saying, if you really think about Roosevelt's upbringing, his world was extraordinarily narrow through his early 20s. I mean, he's surrounded by cousins and family, and they go on these extended trips abroad, but that's with his immediate family. He doesn't really ever go to any kind of public schooling or any experience like that. Then he goes to Harvard, which is not exactly a bastion of diversity in the 1870s, and he meets lots of classmates from New York, which he's interested in, but also Boston. He marries into a very wealthy family, then he's in the assembly, but he doesn't meet a lot of people outside of his world or outside of his class until he comes to this part of the country. And he meets people that didn't grow up with a silver spoon in their mouth. He meets people that are very unlike him in many ways, and it democratizes him to some extent, I think.
President Easton.
But this, our takeaway from something that TJ said earlier about the role of the federal government, let's say in the federal government term. I'm a Westerner, so I was taught from a very early age that the federal government is evil and to stay out of our business. And the federal government has came up a number of times in history. The federal government's role in the boarding schools. The federal government, the federal government ultimately did make progress in the South, but they took a 80-year break between Reconstruction, where they will lead some progress with violence. I mean, that's how the federal government was trying to enforce it if in worldview. And then we got tired. Not we, not our throw out. In the West, these states, these structures, they don't exist without the federal government. The state of Ontario is a creature of and sometimes they should do more, and sometimes they should do less. Anyway.
Well, I mean,
and not all of us are Westerners. Many of us are, and it is really taught from very young age that the federal government is not to be trusted and stay out of our business.
yeah, it's interesting. It's really in the West that where TR himself begins to really develop an idea of a strong federal government, actually, because he endorses when he's still civil service commissioner and helps to lobby for the Reserve Act. I forget this; it's got a couple of different names that establishes national forests. And interestingly, it's based both on, the Boone and Crockett Club elite people who therefore have sway with Congress, who want to preserve hunting lands and wildlands. But also there was a scientific theory that forests bring rain, and that that if you keep these forest lands, you're going to maintain stream flow, and that's going to help in the arid West, and that's a very big part of that. So the idea of, it's very much a kind of, it's the federal government having this kind of benevolent, the benefactor is going to manage things for the lightly populated West, and that all these lands are all federally owned lands. And so TR actually it's not the only, it's one of the contributing factors that really focuses him on a strong federal hand, is actually the West and managing the West. And of course, it still is a huge flashpoint, federal lands and their management.
So Denise, I think you need to weigh in here. The federal government as an intrusive force or as a sense of an alien entity in Western life. This is, of course, particularly true for Native Americans.
Yeah, I was thinking I wasn't going to speak to that because I'd have to go into Indian studies classes as a professor. I could talk for a whole semester on it, but yeah, it's our treaties are with the federal government, and we depend on the federal government on the reservation for any programs, even though we're a sovereign nation. But just unpacking what sovereignty means to Native people would take a lot of books that maybe you guys could write.
Yes, Rich.
My question's for Denise. Obviously, one of the legacies of Theodore Roosevelt is the national parks and other plans. As a Native person, what are your thoughts on national parks? Because a lot of them are located where traditionally.
Let me just quickly repeat because we need this for streaming. But so the question is about the carving of many national parks and monuments and so on out of native lands.
We have a Native female leader now in the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, and I see her doing everything she can to protect national parks. And yes, some of the parks are on sacred lands, but I appreciate that she's in that position to protect them, because I think the previous president was trying to undo, like Bears Ears are different parks that were being protected, and that Native people had the rights to do ceremonies and so on in those parks. So yeah, so I deeply appreciate that.
David Troyer's work saying give the national parks back to the Native peoples,
Yeah.
from whom many of them were carved without consultation or compensation. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think two of the greatest leaders of the last 100 years, Teddy Roosevelt and also Churchill. Yeah, I think there could be a book on the similarities between the two, the way they looked at the world, how they rose to power, what they came from, and truly the impact they had on the world. Tremendous impact. Do you have any comment on that, the two of them?
Churchill v. Roosevelt. You're the biographer. You better weigh in.
Oh boy. Well, we have to remember, Churchill, the reporter slash participant in the Boer War, who was very much a defender of empire. His attitudes toward other peoples and empire actually were very similar to Teddy Roosevelt's, though I think Roosevelt had a, not exactly the same take by any means. But they both believed in the strong, civilized nation, and then guiding the inferior races up toward civilization. That was very much a part of it. They were also, though, very, constantly wanting to push themselves out into the center of things. Really, definitely the man in the arena idea was very much a Churchillian idea. And they also had, huge failures. So, for example, you had Churchill, who has to leave the cabinet. They also had ideas about social order as well. It was Churchill as Home Secretary who sent troops in a Navy cruiser to Liverpool during the general strike there in 1911, for example. Just as younger Roosevelt, wanted to deploy men with Remington rifles whenever there was a labor unrest. But in terms of, standing up to what they saw as injustice abroad, they could also, there's some similarities there as well, where Roosevelt really did have, along with his imperialistic view, the United States around 1898 is very much like China is today. A huge power with enormous economic power that is seeking to assert its influence in the world militarily and in terms of, being a patron and having a paternalistic attitude toward smaller nations around it, sometimes bullying them. I think that's a good comparison for the U.S. around 1898. We're feeling our power, and we believe we have justice on our side. And certainly, he sympathized with the Cuban cause. He wanted to see freedom, but he wanted to see it under U.S. guidance. And certainly Churchill, saw the great evil of Hitler, and yet at the end of the war, he's dividing up spheres of influence with Stalin. So it's this combination of kind of the major power being the dominant and guiding force, even though they're fighting a cause for freedom. They both had their own shades, their own versions of that view, I think.
They met a couple of times, didn't particularly like each other, maybe because they were so similar in some regards. But Churchill was a heavy drinker and Roosevelt a sarsaparilla man, an important distinction. Other questions? Yes, Michael. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to add to that Churchill, I'm not an expert on Churchill, but his career is very much up and down until that moment when he, at least in his own telling, almost alone is warning about Hitler, and Chamberlain, has the peace in our time, and Churchill then is the guy during World War II, and World War II really makes Churchill's career. Roosevelt never had that opportunity with war, and he regretted that he could not be a truly great president without having a war. And I think history has proven him wrong in that way, that we rank him at the top of the presidents often without that. But that would be a contrast or a difference between them, that Churchill's career, I don't think we'd be talking about him today if it had been for World War II.
Yeah, especially after he was a disaster when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he put Britain on the gold standard and the Senate basically spiraling down even deeper. I mean, he made a lot of mistakes.
And then there's Gallipoli, too, of course, 50,000 dead. Right.
Yeah, thanks. One more question about freedom struggles theme. Some freedom struggles are over. Any of these, though, are alive issue. And last night when Denise was speaking, Australians went to the polls and voted on a referendum about the voice of Aboriginal peoples in Australia, and they voted against giving them a voice in Parliament. It's incredible this day and age, but it's 15 years on since the Prime Minister apologized for atrocities and genocide in Australia. And it's a very live issue here. It's a live issue all over the world. I wonder what we can do. We talked about call to action last night and the 95 items in the call to action in Canada. I wonder if Denise might say something about what we could do to address freedom struggles now. I may name this stories. You'd say, besides being able to read a good book, what's possible to address freedom?
the unfinished agenda of freedom struggles. Go ahead, Denise, you started.
I know I just went out of my head what I was going to say. For boarding school trauma is what I'm mostly involved in right now. And when I first started interviewing survivors, one of the questions was, what would healing for boarding school trauma look like? And many of them said an apology from our government, which has never happened. The Canadian, the Pope apologized up there for the residential schools in Canada. We've never had an apology here in the United States. So I think that would help for my personal healing from boarding school trauma. A lot of other survivors have said, well, it won't mean anything because I'll never get my childhood back. So just something simple like that. I think the Pope's apology did help a lot of the boarding school, the residential school survivors up in Canada for their personal healing, because it was a recognition of what was done to us as Native people by the government.
Robert, this is for you. I think, the question that Michael was raising, because I think with the election of Barack Obama and the reaction that it produced, and then we have things like the Floyd killing in Minnesota, for many of us, maybe not paying enough attention, it lifted the veil to remind us of how much work is not yet done.
Right. Again, I think in the discussion yesterday, we talked about history not always moving in a linear, even kind of forward action. Right. To use the academic words, not teleological. Right. That kind of, we don't have an endpoint, or kind of we're naturally ends towards justice. And in that way, right, the kind of emphasizing that kind of you have a civil rights movement where everything was accomplished, and kind of Martin Luther King saw the mountaintop. Tells part of the story, right? But it's the kind of the world of voting rights was left unfinished, and right, kind of we can think about the ways that in the political sphere, kind of the various kind of anti-democratic measures that have been instituted. We can think about what justice looks like in terms of economic justice, kind of the struggle that Martin Luther King was involved in towards the end of his life. He was marching with sanitation workers in Memphis for fair wages, for economic justice, right? Kind of Ella Baker famously says, what is freedom? What is equality if you don't have the money to buy a hamburger? If you can sit at the hamburger counter, but you can't buy that hamburger. The kind of story of Reconstruction, right, is equally important to talk about the story of the 14th and 15th Amendments, the struggle for equality, civil and legal equality, political equality, but it was also a story about land, right? The kind of idea that there was a promise of 40 acres and a mule, the kind of Sherman's Field Order 15, signed January 16, 1865, initially kind of extends that promise in the South Carolina corridor between Jacksonville and Cape Fear. With the election of Andrew Johnson, that order was reversed and that land was given back to former slave owners. And we can imagine a world where an economic basis was kind of really granted to 3 people after the Civil War, right? Kind of the ability to kind of go out free, and kind of a very 19th century idea of freedom, right? You have the freedom from oppression, you have legal equality, but if you're kind of lacking the economic equality, which is what the labor unions were fighting for, which was one of the things that Roosevelt, as a fighter for busting trusts, kind of understood, right? It's not simply a liberal 19th century freedom, right? The kind of freedom from freedom to under the law, right? A 14th Amendment freedom. There's other types of freedoms that also are required to make freedom real, to freedom important and kind of tangible.
So when it comes to gender and sexuality, at the end of the 19th century, we had really the creation of male and female when it comes to the ideas of what that means, and masculinity and femininity and sexuality and homosexuality. Those were all really created by us at the end of the 19th century. And then when it came to after World War II, that's when we started seeing people really push back. You had the movements in the 60s and 70s of free sexuality. You had women's movements. You had the civil rights movements, and all of these kind of by around 2008, we had seen rights when it came to gender and sexuality really kind of peaking, and then eventually we had same-sex marriage and other things. But since 2010s, we've seen those rights really starting to erode. We've seen a real pushback on those rights that we, at different groups, have fought to gain in the mid-20th century. And so I think this really talks to the problem with seeing history as a progressive force. We're not always getting better. We're not always becoming more liberal or becoming more open as societies. A lot of times we're closing down and retrenching and making things harder for those that will come after us. Even economically, we're seeing it being much harder for people, especially millennials and Gen Z, to advance economically and to have a better life than their parents and grandparents. So basically what I'm saying is, like, things aren't always getting better, and in fact sometimes things get worse, and studying history and understanding freedom struggles really teaches us that things do in fact get worse, and sometimes they get better, but they also get worse.
Other questions? Thoughts? Let me ask you another follow-up question just about that, because the argument could be made surely that in the long trajectory, things have gotten much better. The amount of violence in America is down from its historic highs. We're having a blip now. Racial justice is in a lot better shape than it was in 1832. You know, that of course that we're in a time of great uncertainty and anxiety about this, I think, but isn't the overall trajectory of the progressive idea of equality, everyone has a vote, everyone has a stake, that there should be some minimal basis of economic sustainability? Haven't we made enormous strides in a couple of hundred years in this way? And do you see the setback as a blip, or these cycles go that high and that low?
Personally, I would see the cycles going high and low. I don't see, like, I see a lot of the times, I'm seeing a lot more hate now towards LGBTQ people than I did 10 years ago. And that was when I was in politics and very openly queer person. And now I'm seeing the same people who are in the same positions that I was in get significantly more death threats and attacks than I ever did. Things don't always get better. That's basically what it is. I realize that this is the most pessimistic thing that I've said all weekend, or quite a while. However, I'm quite worried about even being anywhere in the world. Like we said about Australia, they just voted not to give Indigenous people a voice at the table. 10 years ago, it's possible they might have won that vote. However, right now, we're at a point where people are worried about their own positions, and we have people who have been in positions of power based on their race, sexuality, gender, who are really fighting to make sure that they get that position back. And that, I think, is the biggest problem right now.
One else on this?
Well, I think that we see a pattern, and pattern is not, I don't want to describe some invisible force to history or characterizing it in a too specific of a way, but there's a tendency for groups that have been in power and that have felt that their ideas of society and of the republic are the norm and who really run things. When they feel their status challenged, or when another idea or group is rising up, to push back hard. So, for example, before the Civil War, most presidents, Supreme Court justices, major U.S. officials were Southern slave owners. And as that began to be challenged, not overthrown even, but challenged, then you got this really militant pro-slavery ideology that pushed the South to, we have to remember, secession was a refusal to accept the result of a presidential election. That's what secession was. And it was this militant pro-slavery refusal to accept any shift in sort of the idea of society, the balance of power, et cetera. Reconstruction was a major shift in power. You have to remember that
Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana were black majority states. And in fact, they did those black, at least participatory governments did a lot of good, and there was a lot of corruption in the white-run states in the South. And yet it led to this big pushback and violent pushback. And so now, we're in a society that's changing, and there's a lot of turmoil because the norm, people who've felt like their lives are the norm this is one factor that's a part of it, is no longer the norm, and it's threatening, and I think it's pushing a big response. And we've seen this with immigration, people pushing back against Eastern and Southern European immigrants at the turn of the century through the 20s, et cetera, et cetera. Changes lead to a reaction. It's often the reaction that drives the crisis.
The question I want to kind of pose back to you, Clay, and this is something that I kind of see kind of tying kind of a lot of the conversations today is kind of where is America? Maybe we put the precision there and say, where is Teddy Roosevelt's America? And I'm interested in the kind of, one of the stories here, right, to kind of to touch on Michael's point about, so what next? What is to be done, right? Kind of how do we kind of think about the unfinished project of freedom? And one of these stories is the story of the public sphere, right? And kind of, I think the kind of thinking about Gilded Age and Progressive Era America is it's a moment where we're searching for order, we're searching for a place, we're searching for community. Kind of the fraternal groups, associational groups, church membership are all at all-time highs, right? You can think about kind of, even as kind of you have the rise of segregation, even as you have kind of various forms of social kind of distance, right? Kind of creating kind of hierarchy. You have these spaces, whether it's the military, whether it's organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic, whether it's the press, right, where you can kind of have these debates in the public sphere. You can have these kind of conversations with people who are not like you, right? You have to kind of, one of the themes that kind of comes up over and over in Roosevelt's life is this is a man who's occasionally willing to be a Democrat, right? He's willing to kind of go into spaces where his petition background would have prevented him or would have kind of told him not to go. We have a very high moment of this kind of public life in World War II moment and kind of post-civil rights, right? One of the things we've kind of seen in this kind of movement away from cities to suburbs, right? And kind of, especially in the last 20, 30 years, right? We kind of see all-time lows in church membership, all-time lows in political participation, kind of fewer and fewer people kind of meeting strangers, meeting kind of people who are not like them. And so one of the kind of projects, and kind of one of the things, again, bringing it back to history, kind of one of the things you can do is you can read more history. But I think you can also think about, at least as we reflect on where we're from, the communities that we're a part of, and kind of how do we kind of fully engage the community? How do we make those communities more democratic? How do we build institutions that kind of require us to all be in community, right? The kind of beloved community that kind of we're trying to, and kind of thinking about what is America, where is America? Maybe for you, Clay, where is Teddy Roosevelt's America?
Well, Teddy Roosevelt's America is gone. I don't want to say much because I'm just a moderator here, but and maybe it's fortunate that it's gone. We get to live on the fumes of the romance of his life out here in Dakota, and that romance is deeply compelling. I think all of you feel it. You'll feel it more this afternoon, that we're glad Roosevelt was, and we're glad that he helped the United States make the transition into the 20th century, into the American century. Many of his methods and much of his rhetoric is objectionable to our way of seeing it, including his wide use of executive orders, which are not embedded in the Constitution at all, as you know, and that's why we're having the intense debates over Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante and so on. The power of a president to name a national monument is just enormous. And so some of what Roosevelt did, we prize because we're the beneficiaries of it. We're going to go to his national park here. But some of the style and methods belong in that era and certainly don't have any legitimacy now. And his prejudices were pretty grim prejudices. But so just to say one word about this, I'm going to be traveling the country over the next 5 or 6 years trying to answer your question, like where are we? And what bothers me most are two things. One is the loss of respect for institutions, most recently the Supreme Court, but Congress, the press, even churches, the American faith in and respect for fundamental civilizational institutions is at an enormous nadir. And the question is that okay? Is that a just response to failed institutions and a really up and down history, or must this be repaired? And if so, how would it be repaired? That's one question. The second question is, as we approach our 250th birthday on July 4th, 2026, what's that going to look like? Do we share a national narrative anymore? Are we one country or two or five? Are we blue and red or urban and heartland or Cracker Barrel and Whole Foods? I mean, these are really difficult problems, and I think that this is a time of, we're celebrating the 250th birthday at a time of extraordinary anxiety and uncertainty. That should be opportunity to really have a narrative about what America is, but it's infinitely more complicated than it was in 1976. And I'm bracing myself for what I think is going to be the culture war on acid. We just have time for a little more. I don't think that answers your question, but at least it's a start. Shannon, of the BCA, tomorrow, the Elkhorn trip.
The Elkhorn, that would be great. We'd love to have you. You can be at Chimney Bark at 9 a.m. There's a shuttle service out. You may have parked below if we built the shuttle, but I want to come back to one thing because you're all in academias. We're thankful to be here because of Dickinson State. Dickinson State recently had their own budget in the president. At least it's tough choices. But within the state of North Dakota, I see we have the opportunity. We live in a small state. We have difficult conversations that we need to have. I'm a product of Minot Public Schools, and I feel terrible of what I know native history of my own state. I'm learning of it, and it's incredibly sad and tough stuff. But we need to have the conversations of what we have. We live in a time where, what TJ had said earlier, it's us and them. It's these good or evil. And unfortunately, our politicians and our media, they want to put us in this place. Is the university system the place? And they're under incredible threats because you can't teach, Florida's the case study that we're doing right now. We can't teach African American studies or some curriculum. Is that the place where we need to have these greater conversations? Because we can talk about these real tough, meaty issues that are, and what's good for all of us in our community. What TJ started with the other night I thought was great because he talks about kind of the European model coming over, and then it really plays out as you see Roosevelt being bullied, and then showing up in Western North Dakota with 5 Native Americans riding up, and he gets a rifle out right away. And he's not even thinking about understanding the other side. He's just thinking about maybe he was bullied or he wants to defend himself. But how can we have a conversation in a small state like ours? Because I feel like we have the potential, but we have politicians that once you say we're sorry, then we're getting into the legality of, are we going to have to give money, resources, pay $1 billion surplus? So I'm curious what your take is of the role the university plays to forward this struggle to Clay's point.
Well, assuming that we can all agree that the country is in disarray and kind of a narrative anxiety, you've opened a can of worms here, Shannon. The role of the university in being a platform for this, this is a really interesting time in university life, and you're seeing it play out at this moment on the campuses around the country per Israel and Hamas. Who wants to start here? Robert?
I mean, this is a moment where, on the one hand, right, kind of the university can be an easy political punching bag. But I think also in terms of kind of the long history, right, thinking of the Moral Land Grant Act, and kind of the importance of agricultural colleges, right, in terms of expanding this Republican, lowercase r Republican, dream of uplift, right? Kind of the ability to have social mobility requires both the public schools at the K through 12 level, but it also requires higher education to be available to all citizens, right? The kind of idea of the state colleges, right? Kind of, bless you, affordable state colleges, right? It kind of one of the kind of promises of mid-20th century America that's increasingly disappearing as kind of state institutions increasingly depend on out-of-state students and kind of cut budgets on those institutions. Also, right, just the idea of academic freedom and institutions being able to provide a place to discuss divisive concepts, right? A place to discuss difficult ideas. Clearly not every institution in American life should be handling those discussions, right? And it's not, I mean, these are hard conversations that require nuance, that require expertise, and we just happen to have universities that are kind of uniquely equipped, not always doing the best job, they make mistakes. But I think we can understand the role of the university, both as a kind of a public square, a public sphere, kind of producing but also as a place where knowledge can be produced, the right kind of difficult knowledge, kind of challenging ideas can be produced. Not to say that's the only space. I think we can also, again, think about the broader public sphere, thinking about kind of way local communities can have conversations at different levels. But again, the university, despite the ongoing attacks in some states, continues to be a place that aspires to be a kind of central node in American public life.
Ben, please.
And then you keep doing that. Everyone on that.
Yeah, I agree with Rob, and the university is not the only place for this, but I mean, I firmly believe it's so crucial. When you're talking about 18 to 22-year-olds as a kind of stereotypical population, that's the future of the country. And the university is a place to be exposed to all kinds of ideas and to learn civility. And the fact is, if history teaches us things, it teaches us that not everyone has seen the world the way you do. And so it teaches that respect for others. At its best, it teaches that humility as well, and that we all have a perspective, but that we have to be willing to listen and to dialogue peacefully with our neighbors. If we don't, then there are some examples in history of how that can go south really quickly. And so it's not a panacea or a cure-all, but the university is a place, liberal arts education is a place for empathy, for critical thinking, for reasoned dialogue. That is one of the ways forward for the country out of the impasse that we're in. And again, I think it comes back to humility, that you can have strong convictions, but it has to be held in tension with someone else sees it differently than me, and it's not that I'm right and they're wrong and all my party is good and all the other party is evil. It has to be give and take.
But we need the Chicago Manifesto of saying that there needs to be safe space on university campuses for a very wide and diverse set of perspectives, and there cannot be an orthodoxy that shuts down discourse. And I think we're all a little alarmed by some of what we're hearing in that regard. Denise, I want to ask you a question because Shannon sort of brought it up. He said he laments that at Minot High School he did not have enough Native education. Montana requires Native education in its constitution. North Dakota's kind of slowly moving in that direction. What do you think we need by way of education about Native America in the state of North Dakota?
I think there was a bill that passed
Right.
that teachers, I believe, need to, well, because I was on a committee to start developing the Native American curriculum for the state. But then the Kamloops happened and boarding school issue erupted here on the national and international level. So I jumped off that committee. So yeah, I think we need more information and more curriculum starting in elementary school on up through college. When I was hired as a professor at NDSU in the educational leadership, I was the first female, first of all, in educational leadership. It was a male-dominated area for...
What year was that?
2006. For principals and superintendents and so on. I was also the first Native American hired at NDSU as a professor. Yeah, that's pretty sad. In the heart of Indian country. So teaching I can teach anyone to be a principal. So I didn't do Indian studies. I wasn't part of Indian studies. Like as a poet, I'm not an English major and so on. But every year there was a student in their, what do you call it, when they would do their, what do you call it, when they talk about who was a professor at the end of every class. The evaluations, thank you. Hated those things, but I did read them, and I told my students I would read them. And I would also take suggestions and improve my classes, but there was always someone that said that they didn't like having a Native American as a professor. They didn't like, I tried not to, it wasn't an Indian studies class, but I said, I am your cultural diversity class, because there was no one else in the education leadership or even in the education teaching school that was minority. So those stung, those hurt, and I would bring them to my boss and so on, but there was nothing that could be done. But I'd get slammed fairly often about just being a Native professor at NDSU. Pretty tough to take, but then they brought in Michael Yellowbird, and he also was teaching a Native Studies class for the first time at the university. And then Dr. Donald Warren was heading up the master's program, Harvard graduate and so on. But things were so rough at the university level that all of us left. all of the Native professors left NDSU. Don went to UND. I retired, and Michael went up to Canada University of Winnipeg. So even just, and I had to realize that a lot of the students were maybe farmer students, were Trump supporters, and that made it hard for me to really say a lot of things that I wanted to say, because I was afraid of getting slammed in their evaluations. So yeah, we still need a lot. We have a long ways to go here in North Dakota. I wanted to say something too about what's happening in Australia. We're trying to get more Native people from reservations into the state legislature, and it's made difficult because of recently the redistricting. So we lost a Native person from our tribe because of the redistricting from District 9A to 9B, and a non-Native Republican full Trump supporter made it in us, representing me, in our reservation area. So, and then a few years ago, if you recall, there was I believe it was a law that stated that you cannot have a post office box address on your driver's license in order to vote. Every reservation, we're a village. We don't have street addresses. So every reservation, so it would have stopped the Native vote. So our tribe, I can just speak for my tribe, but it was other tribes also. We brought in the Iggy Breaky guy came in, the Iggy Breaky, that sang the Iggy Breaky song.
Billy Ray Cyrus.
So yeah, Billy Ray Cyrus came into the reservation. We had the young people, the youth, started the movement. And Mark Ruffalo came in, and he's a movie star. And I heard that he was giving kisses to elders, so boy just really ran down to the auditorium, but he'd already left, doggone it. So we got 911 addresses. So I have a P.O. box, but on my driver's license I have 311 Education Lane. It's a 911 address, and I don't even think 911 can even find it because I live way out in the bush. But so we actually melted down the tribal machine that was making cards, because we just hundreds and hundreds of people signed up. Or we had to change, if we wanted to vote, we had to change our addresses. So that was, to me, that was another Republican ploy, because most reservations are blue. If you look at a map of the state, it's red, and then in the little 4 blue dots are reservations. We vote Democrat, majority. So we still have that struggle just to get the vote out.
So I want to give TJ the last word. We're out of time, unfortunately. I wish we had more time, but we can talk informally on the bus and on our hike and so on. Thank all of you for being here. TJ, you're our keynote, but you're also writing a biography of Mr. Theodore Roosevelt. You have a biography of Vanderbilt, and you have a book about Custer, and a book about Jesse James. Now you've taken on this extraordinary subject. I'm sure that North Dakota is going to play a larger role in the book now that you've been here. And that you're going to say you couldn't have written it. You could never have written the book without your time in North Dakota. Tell us when we can read this book, and tell us a little bit about your thinking at this moment. What part are you working on?
Well, I'm actually in the governorship right now in terms of writing. And it's, when you talk about his time in North Dakota, I think it's interesting because we usually think of it as, it's always talked about as his escape from the depression he had after his wife died. And I think that emotional impact was real. It was huge. He had planned to come before she died. He spent months after she died working in the New York State Legislature. While he was heavily engaged in ranching here, of course, his home was the Pullman car as he went back and forth. And he went back and he was the leader of the independent-minded Republicans in the state convention. He didn't drop out of politics. He was still a major political figure that, if we moderate a little bit this was his escape, then it reinforces the fact that he was deeply we just, don't overemphasize that too much, because we have to remember he was deeply invested in the Dakota Territory, and he was deeply invested in the people here, and he was proud all his life to identify himself with the West, and that the greatest moment of his life, fighting in in Cuba, for him, in his own worldview of himself, his view of himself, his view of the world, his place in the world, that proud moment, he constantly talked about the regiment and, you know, the Westerners who were in the regiment, the natives who were in the regiment. And he was incredibly proud of belonging to the West. And, you know, he was always a man of the East. He never stopped being that. He never got rid of his evening clothes. But it was a defining experience for him, you know, above and far beyond simply escaping his troubles.
So just remember as you write this book that he said to Albert Fall in 1904, if you could erase every memory of your life and only keep one, just one, and everything else that you have ever done would disappear, as in the Men in Black films, what experience would you keep? And Roosevelt said, I'd keep my time as a rancher and cowboy in Dakota Territory. So that should be the first quotation, I think. And thank you, everyone. Let's have lunch.